It's Wednesday, April 23rd. I'm Adam Walsh, and this is The Signal. Today on the show, we will talk Canada's military, Arctic security, the future of NATO, Canada's relationship with the United States, and more. My guest for the discussion, 39-year veteran of uniformed service to Canada, a former Vice Chief of Defence Staff, Mark Norman. So, folks, if you've got thoughts for today's show or questions, text us 709-327-8206. Email us thesignal@cbc.ca. Mark Norman, welcome to The Signal. How you doing?
Adam, thank you very much for having me, and thanks for taking an interest in this interesting topic.
Oh, gosh, look, when I found out you're going to be around town, I was like, I know who to have for a conversation I've been wanting to have for a long time. So you're the perfect person for this. Easy question to start, though. When did you join the military?
Well, way back. I joined in 1980 in Kingston, Ontario. I'd been sailing the previous summers, and the Naval Reserve unit there, HMCS Cataraqui, which basically is a sister unit of HMCS Cabot here in St. John's, was running a summer training program, and I signed up. I loved it, and I stayed in the reserves through university, and then when I graduated, I transferred to the regular force, and that was a while ago. It was a great run.
As you were starting, what globally and for this country, what were the security concerns? What was the talk then for the Canadian military?
Oh, well, I mean, we're early 80s. We're peak Cold War.
Yeah.
The idea of the wall coming down was still almost a decade away. And so, as I went through my training, our focus openly was on countering what was seen as the Russian threat of the day. So if we fast forward, there's some irony in that, but there was no question that was our focus, and that's what our training was designed for.
So then, during your career, from Cold War days, how did things evolve for threat and for the military and missions?
Yeah, so I think we look at this through a few different decades, and it's not just the evolution of how Canada may have contributed in those different decades, but how we look at alliances and NATO, the international security community. So, Cold War right through to 89, the wall came down. And in essence, this is when most Western democracies started to talk openly about the peace dividend as a result of having, in theory, and now we look back in hindsight, having defeated the Russian threat of the day and starting to reorient themselves into what the new security environment would look like for the 90s. Then we started to see a lot of Eastern Europe fracturing, Middle East and parts of Africa that had been controlled to some degree by proxy wars through the preceding period, also starting to fracture. That's where Canada and others started to see increased activity in, we talk about the Balkans, former Yugoslavia, those kinds of things. Those became operations primarily under NATO. They lasted through to well into the 90s and early aughts, as people call them. And we then saw not so much an expansion geographically, but the role of NATO increasing, being employed as a force for good, and Canada playing a key role in that. And this is where we see things like Libya and other challenges, sort of Middle East and Southern Europe adjacent. And then, of course, 9/11, key moment that I'm sure most of your listeners will remember, which then caused a massive shift in the geostrategic situation. We then entered into the decade or so of counterinsurgency. We saw the Iraq conflicts play out, very similar. We're dealing with terrorist or terrorist adjacent type organizations, and then through well into sort of the middle part of the 2015 timeframe, And now, of course, we find ourselves in a situation where we're looking at the rise of China, which is now a huge influence in terms of international peace and security, especially in the Indo-Pacific area, but it extends well beyond that into Africa and elsewhere. And of course, most recently we see the invasion of Crimea in 2014, then the subsequent invasion of Ukraine proper, now running into its third year, and then of course in the last few months we've seen some somewhat disturbing messages out of Washington with respect to the Americans wanting to withdraw from their traditional role as an international leader in terms of peace and security, especially in Europe. So long answer, but there's probably at least 5 or 6 stages in that evolution.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much history there, right? Well, when you think about the Canadian military, what are some of the ever-present issues from when you started up until now? Because, for me, I think it's everything from ships to planes to pay to recruitment, that type of stuff. What have you how has that kind of been ever-present, or what are the peaks and troughs over the years for this type of a thing?
Yeah, so I think if we look at it through a couple of lenses here, there's some constants.
Yeah.
We'll start with those, and then we can.
Yeah.
And then what has changed over that period? I mean, the constants are the armed forces cannot function without good people, and that is a constant. It's also a constant challenge because it means that you need to continuously recruit, attract, train, and retain talented people. And I mean, this is true of any organization. I mean, we're sitting here looking across at the Health Sciences Center. I mean, those are the challenges that affect the healthcare system equally. But nothing works without really good people. That's the first thing. The second thing is that, you mentioned there's always an equipment focus to this. You got to match the people to the right equipment. The equipment needs to be up to date. It needs to be relevant to the threats or the different scenarios that you would want to see your people employed in. And there's lots of challenges over my 40 years and since I retired with respect to aging equipment, its operational relevance, et cetera, et cetera. And we could burn the whole conversation on that, but we're not going to. And then there's, in really simple terms, what the military describes as readiness, which is their preparedness. So you take the people, you make sure they're properly trained, they're looked after, they're ready to do their jobs, you match them with the right equipment, you make sure they're exercised and trained and they're ready to go out the door at whatever an appropriate level of reaction is. If you're search and rescue, then it's literally a matter of minutes. If you're talking about a major formation of perhaps an army formation or even a task group from a naval perspective, that could be days, weeks, or even sort of 3 months notice to move kind of thing. And so those are sort of the 3 pillars, if you will, of how the system works. And they have ebbed and flowed over that period. We've had periods of time where the military has not been seen to be a particularly attractive thing to do. That was certainly the case when I joined. Then we had periods where we were, in essence, turning people away. Afghanistan, for example, where we had just a continuous flow of both motivated, but more importantly, skilled and capable applicants. And then, we've had more recently, we're seeing some challenges with respect to what I would describe as the issue of relevance. So it's difficult for people to see themselves in an organization if they're not exactly sure why it exists and what purpose they're going to serve other than a job and a pension. And that's not why you join the military. You join the military to do something different and special.
Yeah, and you want to know what the mission is.
Right, exactly. And there's lots of them.
Yeah.
So those things have, if you look at those 3 variables, to oversimplify it, through the phases that we described a few minutes ago of the evolution of modern defense and security. You can see how things, there's big investment periods. The money comes in waves. So, you have a whole bunch of new stuff, and then that stuff gets old. I mean, the topical issue for your listeners, we're still arguing about whether we're buying the right jets to replace the jets that we purchased in the early 1980s, and I'm not exaggerating. So, I mean, these are sadly some of the challenges we have in the Canadian conversation.
Well, it's like those old stories you get folks who I know who talked about when they were kids looking at the Sea Kings. I mean, like, I'd like to, be in a helicopter someday, and then like decades later, it's still the same piece of kit, right? Until they replace them.
Yeah, which was only fairly recently.
Yeah.
And in fact, I'm having a hard time. I'm still to this day seeing images of the new Cyclone helicopter flying off of ships, and I have to kind of do a head shake because to me it's so new and out of place, because I spent 40 years with Sea Kings, which is ridiculous. But that's a really good example.
Why do you think there are issues around the whole raison d'être? I guess now, like back in the Cold War when you started, perhaps did people understand? Like, was there more cohesiveness around why you would be in the military and what it was for, compared to kind of some of what you're alluding to for now, and the military for why folks are in and where it's going and morale?
Yeah, well, I think, you look at it through the perspective of those who are in the organization, and they see their raison d'être, as you say, their focus, their mission, is very clear, or has been clear traditionally over those periods that we talked about a few minutes ago. And then you look at prospective applicants, those people who might want to join the military. And I mentioned to you the Afghanistan experience. I mean, it was very clear. It was top of mind. It was visceral. It was emotional. Canadians were watching their sons and daughters sadly come home in coffins from a conflict halfway around the world. And rather than dismissing it and criticizing it, I mean, there was healthy debate, which you should have in a democracy. There was a sense of rallying around the contribution, and people wanted to be part of it. The Cold War you mentioned, people weren't necessarily understanding it. It was just a fact of life, because the entire generation had grown up under that security mindset and framework. And then over the last 20 years or so, it's shifted and evolved so many times for so many reasons. It kind of becomes an issue of, are people actually, do they understand why it's important, and do they see themselves as playing a role in that?
Yeah.
And so, today, strangely, I'm told that we have a bit of an uptick in applications to the military. And although nobody has the perfect answer, it appears that part of it is a secondary impact of this increase in patriotism that we're seeing play out in the public space as a result of all the crap that's going on with our neighbors to the south. So they're hard to predict sometimes how Canadians want to respond. And of course, the Canadians of the 1980s are not the Canadians of 2025. Everybody comes from different backgrounds. They have different perspectives, not only on what it means to be Canadian, but also what their own personal experiences and perspectives might be. Some of them may be inclined to not like militaries in general. They may have come from countries or regimes where the military were part of the problem and not part of the better part of their society. And so, that's going to influence whether they themselves or they want their children to participate in an organization that, from their own family history, they associate with a negative experience. So, it's a continuously evolving space, I guess, is the best way to describe it.
You mentioned south of the border. Back in February, you wrote a commentary for the National Post. Canada's relationship with the U.S. can't be saved. We are under attack and must act accordingly. You talk about Article 4 with NATO in there. How, looking at that piece from February, how are you feeling about it now and your thoughts? How have your thoughts evolved?
Well, so first thing is, I have to, it's a bit of a declaration. I don't write the headlines.
This is a famous journalism thing. Yeah. So, and believe me, I've been on this side too before.
Exactly. For all the listeners out there.
Caveat.
Exactly. I take full credit for the content of the column because I was asked by the Post to write it. I tweeted something a bit provocative, and that triggered two different columns. But to your point, how do I feel? Well, sadly, I'd like to be wrong. I am wrong often. I would have liked to have been wrong in this particular circumstance. I was being provocative, but I think we're starting to see as this plays out that sadly there is some lasting and structural damage to what we imagined as our relationship economically, our relationship socially, culturally, and our relationship from a security and defense perspective. Do I believe it is broken to the point that it can't be repaired? Absolutely not. However, I think we have to rethink how we want to go forward in a new partnership. I guess is the best way to describe it. The relationship has changed, and we have to evolve in light of those changes.
For folks who don't think about this, right? How intertwined are our militaries? Because one thing every Christmas, NORAD Santa tracker, right? This is what a lot of people will see, and they'll say NORAD. But there's so much more to it, obviously, than just tracking Santa. Can you give us an explanation?
Yeah, but that's it's a great way to kick it off, Adam. Seriously. So, well, look at the foundational level. We're highly integrated, okay, and I'll take a few minutes to explain it, and without delving too much into history, this all grows primarily from our experiences in the Second War and beyond, and our relationships not just in the defense of North America through NORAD, North American Aerospace Defense Command, which is the only binational command in the world. And by binational, it means there's actually two countries and they share command responsibility. And they report to their respective heads of state. So, this is a thing. It's been around for decades, and it works really well. But it's deeper than that because it's not just an Air Force or air defense thing. The navies, the armies, the Canadian Army have general officers and other senior officers of various ranks embedded in U.S. national Army commands, and some of the most famous ones, the 101st Airborne and other things like that. We have Canadian officers in those organizations. Special Operations Forces, fully integrated. And this goes back to the Devil's Brigade of the Second World War. If your listeners are looking for a good 1960s vintage movie about the Second War, that paints Canada in a great way, then I recommend the Devil's Brigade, which was a unit which was created out of a good idea to combine arguably some of the worst elements of American and Canadian forces into a special elite unit that went around Europe and did some very effective and nasty things. And the navies operate together all the time. There's senior officers embedded in again the senior commands. We have Americans on exchange, so it exists everywhere. The training, everybody does things slightly differently, but as you know, one of the great values of alliances and partnerships is that you can come together in a time of crisis and you may not know each other personally, but you know how each other think and how they operate, and you can very quickly set up whatever needs to be done and work together. Yeah, so I'm not sure how much more detail you want, but it's a real thing, and it does affect people on a day-to-day basis. We have hundreds of people in the United States on a full-time basis. Yeah.
So what do you think, with this American pivot that is, or however you want to phrase it, that's happening, what's the way forward for military planning in a time when the intertwined, the lockstep of these militaries are somewhat out of sync?
Yeah, I think the simple answer, and there's a risk in giving it too simple an answer, but is that we try to separate the politics of what's playing out in the public domain from the practicality of professional military planning and contingency operations and those kinds of things. My understanding, and of course, I've been out for a few years now, but my understanding from friends who are still serving is that on a day-to-day basis, they're doing exactly that. They are separating the rhetoric that we're observing from the importance of their day-to-day jobs. So if you're managing, for example, submarine operations somewhere on the east coast of the United States in cooperation with our American allies, you're potentially tracking adversary submarines, theoretically.
Theoretically, yeah.
Then that's your focus.
Yeah.
That's your mission, and you get on with it, and everybody works together. Some of the practical challenges, so where it becomes difficult, and these are, I think, the risks going forward, is when we start to get into conversations about arbitrary denial of access to information and different classifications or intelligence and things like that. Because as soon as you start to shut off those valves, if I can refer to them that way, those supplies of information or the ability to share information back and forth, then you start to impair the operational effectiveness of whatever those organizations happen to be. At the moment, I think it's manageable, but that continues to be a risk, especially when we look at some of the, I'll be polite and describe them as arbitrary edicts that come out of Washington on an ongoing basis.
You're listening to The Signal. I'm Adam Walsh. Today on the show, we're talking Canada's military. We will talk Arctic security. We're talking the future of NATO, Canada's relationship with the United States, and more. My guest today on the show, Vice-Admiral retired Mark Norman. If you've got thoughts on today's show for us or questions as we're having this chat, text us 709-327-8206, the signal at cbc.ca. This is good. I mean, this is kind of a big question, but why is NATO important? You're like, well, we could talk for hours.
Yeah, well, okay, so it's important, I think. I'll give you two key reasons. The first one is that it is not just its history, it is the longest and most successful military alliance in history, the largest, 32 nations. It represents it's a manifestation of shared views with respect to common interests and the whole idea of collective security, okay? And people talk openly about Article 5, which gets all of the attention, which is, an attack on one is an attack on all. And I might add, for your listeners, historically, the only time since the alliance was created in 1949, originally 12 countries, of which Canada was one, and has now grown to 32, the only time Article 5 has ever been invoked was after 9/11, and it was invoked by the United States.
Yeah.
So, there is some irony to the fact that the only country that's ever invoked the collective security protocol of Article 5 is the country that has now openly abandoned they haven't left the alliance, but they've certainly put the other 31 members on notice that the rules of the game have changed. So that's important. The other reason that I think it's important is that it does create an ideological block of predominant, well, they are what we call them Western democratic nations that all have shared values and shared interests, and basically are prepared to not only look out for one another, but they're prepared to look out for what they believe matters. And so we look at that through the lens of the Ukrainian experience at the moment, where although Ukraine is not a member of NATO, the entire alliance is committed to supporting Ukraine, and some of the European countries are much more supported to supporting Ukraine, not just for material and practical reasons, but because of the ideological reasons of the fact that invading another country is wrong, and we're not going to put up with it. So that kind of hopefully is a useful answer for you.
Yeah, and that alliance, right? That having allies like that, that's a global stability thing too, in a way, right? Like because of that, you're not having folks picked off typically, and because of the bigger power that is there of a nuclear umbrella with the United States and everything. I mean, in France and Britain as well. Does that not help with stability globally? Or?
Yeah, absolutely, it does. But as we've seen the evolution of the international security situation expand beyond the traditional geographic interests of NATO, and so you're touching on the evolution of NATO, not just in terms of its practical challenges on the ground, who's in, who's not in, the Eastern European flank, et cetera. But now it's a broader issue with respect to ideology, way of life, and concerns about, the Indo-Pacific. Yeah. And people will argue, well, that's not a concern of a European or predominantly European alliance. Well, it absolutely is, because those countries all share interests and concerns about international security, and they're very specifically concerned about the actions of China as it relates to what it's doing in its own backyard. So
well, yeah, and you've got like NATO light with like Japan and South Korea. They're under
correct.
a nuclear umbrella, but they're not part of the club.
Right, and Australia. And
yes.
There's a number of Middle Eastern countries who are, they have observer status within NATO. And so this is what makes it so successful. It also contributes to some of the complexity of managing the alliance. But, I think NATO is here to stay. I think like a lot of organizations, it will evolve. I'm not going to guess where the current administration may be on any given day. It's a Wednesday today, so, it's hard to guess what they're going to say. But at the moment, I think they've put the Europeans on notice. The Europeans have responded very constructively and very positively, and they are stepping up, and I think they're able to fill some of the potential void that the Americans have created, even if it's just spiritually. The reality is that there's way more value in the alliance than not.
Mm. This brings me to 2% spending. If you're following anything over the years around NATO and why is that number so important? Why 2%?
Yeah, it's a totally it's a completely arbitrary number, but it's an arbitrary number that has some basis to it from the analysis that they've done, and they being NATO. Okay, yeah. So. And you need to look at NATO as a living, breathing organization in and of itself that is supported by its 32 members. So it's not a ridiculously arbitrary number. There is merit to it, and when you look at the averages across the alliance, it does make sense. You've heard recently, or your listeners would have heard recent references to the fact that it in and of itself, it's insufficient. You have to recognize that 2% was agreed more than 10 years ago, based on what was happening 10 years ago. Yeah. So it would make sense that the number has to evolve. But I think from a Canadian perspective, and this is where it's interesting to see the evolution of the conversation in Canada, if I can just touch on that.
Yeah, sure.
Because I would have never in my almost 40 years in uniform imagined a day when it would actually be a topic of conversation in mainstream media or even in the public domain in Canada. It is now. But I think what we're starting to see, and I like it, is an evolution of the conversation, and it's playing out right now in the context of the election and the platforms of the two major parties in particular, whereby it's not just about 2% for the sake of 2%. It's about 2% because of what it represents and what it allows you to do. I'm on the public record several times as saying that if we were actually producing and maintaining the armed forces that Canada actually needs, we would be well above 2% anyway, because we would need to be. And so we wouldn't find ourselves in a situation where we feel like we're compelled to spend to this arbitrary figure because we would have been doing what we should have been doing. And I don't know what the number is, but it's somewhere between 2 and 3%. And we would be doing it because it's the right thing for Canada and not because we made a commitment to do it.
Yeah.
I think we should stand by our commitment to do it, but that's not the reason we should be doing it. And so I am both I'm pleased to see the evolution of the conversation in Canada, but I'm also somewhat cynical because I unfortunately have lived for decades where give a government an opportunity to find a way to not spend money on defense, and they will find a way to not spend money on defense. So I'm a little cynical in that regard.
Yeah, look at Canada, its military, what we need for it, what it should be, and then when you look at the percentage, like, oh, guess what? That happens to be above 2% because of that's what to the point you're making, right? As opposed to how do we get to this arbitrary number? Look at what is needed. This ties in. We got a note here from Paul Reed, a question from Mark Norman. You mentioned issues not new with D&D, people, equipment, readiness. It's easy to describe the symptoms, but what systemic corrections need to be made within D&D to affect these issues, or for if we're looking at this spending and what the military should and could be? What needs to be added and explored?
Well, nothing needs to be added. So let's be clear.
Yeah.
So Paul, I think was his name. Yeah. So great question, Paul. Thank you. Look, I think at the end of the day, part of the reason why defense spending is sadly such a lightning rod for attention in Canada is because we're not very good at it, and yes, there are lots of very good examples of how things can be done successfully and smartly and on time and on budget, but that is not the norm. And there's no point in lamenting it or no point in trying to figure out how and why things are the way they are. But fundamentally, we need to change the way we do business. And so why I said adding is not the answer.
Yeah.
Removing is the answer. Start with hurdles, red tape, bureaucracy. I mean, these are not bumper stickers. These are real challenges. There's way too many organizations and people involved in decision making. I'm all for checks and balances, so I don't want any of your listeners to assume that things should be, done behind closed doors and without the necessary, protocols to protect the taxpayer. At the end of the day, that's whose money we're spending here. But I could bore your listeners with the levels of detail and oversight and bureaucracy that are involved in some of the simplest procurements.
It takes decades, right?
Well, it's ridiculous. I mean, just a few months ago, we demonstrated that we couldn't even buy sleeping bags. And so, nothing surprises me, but the solutions to Paul's question are in simplifying the steps, reducing the number of organizations and agencies that are involved in decision making, I'm quite intrigued and pleased to see in the Liberal platform, not to get political, I'm just using it as an example, they are committed to basically putting everything under one single authority. For your listeners, anything over $10 million in the Canadian military spending goes beyond the Department of National Defence, and it involves at least 3, if not 5, different agencies. And I know $10 million is a lot of money to most people, but when you're buying stuff for the armed forces, it's a rounding error. And so just imagine the levels of complexity that are involved in that. So that's a long answer to say, get rid of the bureaucracy, streamline it. Accountabilities and authorities need to be, simplified, and we need to shorten the time frame. And there's lots of players involved. The military takes way too long to decide what they need, partly because they only buy something every 40 years, and they think that they're going to buy something that's going to last another 40 years. We need to shorten not only the procurement cycle, but we need to shorten the life cycle of these, as I call them, big shiny objects. And they're not all big shiny objects, but everything suffers the same problems. We need to stop hanging on to things as long as we do, and we need to look at more innovative private sector practices with respect to how we own or operate assets. We don't have to own everything. That's been the model of the past, and I don't think it's a modern business model. You look at airlines, for very few airlines these days own their own aircraft. So, I mean, there's a difference between some military-specific capabilities. Okay, those should be the exceptions, but the problem is we try to make everything the same. And we're not being particularly open-minded, and there's lots of best practices out there.
So when we're thinking about buying, purchasing, the future, here's something from David Moores that came in as well. Would you inquire how your guest might view purchasing jets for umpteen billions from the only country to have ever threatened Canadian sovereignty, especially given how much control the USA maintains over their operation? So here we are again, though, right? We've talked about south of the border. We've talked about NATO. We're talking about the future of the Canadian forces. The jets are on the table for the future. So how do we look at that, and how do we think about that?
No, Dave's question is really, really useful for a couple of reasons. First of all, it forces us to have what I would describe as some uncomfortable conversations. A lot of what we have done, not just from a military perspective, from an economic perspective, industrial, has been easy. I'm not saying life is easy, it's anything but that. But we have made decisions because in relative terms, they're easy. And now the events of the last month or so have made us at least question whether some of the assumptions that was part of things being easy. Well, it's easy. We buy from the Americans. We're part of their supply chain. They're always going to give us. We're a trusted partner. You can insert the 4 or 5 arguments as to why that is easy and therefore makes sense. Dave's question goes to a couple of key things. The first thing is it goes back to what we were discussing earlier with respect to access to information. So if you're concerned about being denied access to information, and that information is integral to operational capability in the aircraft, well, now you have to ask yourself the question, all right, what's the risk to Canada? Are we at risk of not being able to use the full suite or range of capabilities that we're paying for because we don't have full access to, in this case, let's specifically talk about mission planning in the F-35? The answer is, yeah, there is risk. Can that risk be managed or mitigated? Of course it can, but it cannot be assumed. And so I'm on record as having said recently that I think re-examining this is actually a good thing, not for political purposes, but because it's going to force us to have these uncomfortable conversations. Other parts of it relate to logistics, supply chain, related to the actual fabrication of the aircraft. Canada produces components for the aircraft, as do all the partners in the program. It is a partnership in the true sense of the word. And so, could the Americans find alternate sources for those? Yes, of course they would. They would do that. But the question for us is, are we concerned about having access to the supply management, spare parts, and supply chain of the aircraft being shut off or restricted? Maybe. The flip side of this, the concern I have with respect to alternatives, is that we've said no to alternatives. And really, there's only two viable options at the moment. One is the French aircraft, and the other is the Swedish aircraft, both of which are great airplanes in their own right. But the reality is that you can't turn, as we just said in the last question, you can't turn the procurement system around on a dime. Even if you were to make a decision that you're going to not pursue the F-35, what's your plan B? How long is plan B going to take to implement? And what are the risks associated with it? And so I guess the simple way of describing this is it's a complex equation with multiple variables. And we tend to focus on one variable at a time, and we'll go in and we'll play around and we'll change it. And then we don't realize until perhaps it's too late that we ended up messing up a couple other variables. I'd also argue that other countries are having the same concerns. And your listeners would have experienced this during the pandemic, where we couldn't get access to personal protective equipment, PPE. We couldn't get access to vaccines. We couldn't do a bunch of things because A, we'd shut off our own supply chain, and B, we were on wait lists or in bidding wars with other people who were competing for the same thing. So there's no simple solution to any of this, Dave,
No.
to David's question. Yeah. We need to have these. They're grown-up conversations. They're not helped when they become political. I'm not a big believer in Team A beating Team B over the head with some political rhetoric around a specific issue. But I think as a country that has to learn how to stand on its own 2 feet, it's probably reasonable that we ask ourselves, do we want to do this? And if we do have concerns, what's our plan to mitigate those risks?
Way, way back in 2002, when I was on the MCDVs trying to get my ticket, we sailed up to Baffin Island, to Kimmeroot. And at the time, it was the talk of that trip for the coastal defense vessels was the importance of the Arctic. It was a long time ago now. Right. And yet, here we are today, right? Yeah. So you're talking multiple decades of talking about Arctic importance. And back then, I remember they're like, well, if you don't patrol it, there's risk of losing it. What is the importance for Arctic sovereignty and security? Why is it such a focus for us now? Well, and why has it been for decades?
Yeah, I mean, it's huge. And to your point, we have not just underinvested, but we have underappreciated the significance of this. So at the risk of being provocative, which is in my nature, I'm going to start with a statement to the effect that we do not behave as an Arctic nation. We are an Arctic nation based on our geography. We are members of the Arctic Council. We are proudly self-identify as an Arctic nation. We do not behave, however, as an Arctic nation for a variety of reasons. We have a romantic sense of the Arctic in the South. And by South, I mean anyone who's not in the Arctic, okay? Those of us, and we're all Southerners in that context, or most. This manifests itself in a variety of different ways. And it's not just military capability, but I know that's at the heart of your question. We we have not properly invested in infrastructure. We've not properly invested in the northern communities, indigenous communities. And I'm not just talking about spending money. And this is where, we got to make a distinction between, yes, it is all about money, but it's not just spending money. It's about actually making useful investments in what matters. And so from a geostrategic perspective, why this matters is, well, first of all, it's our backyard. Okay, no, we don't have exclusive monopoly over the entire Arctic. That's why we are an Arctic nation. There are others. But we are responsible for a lot of it. Some of it's solid and dirt-like. Some of it is semi-solid and turns into liquid, and some of it is liquid. But the reality is it's ours and it's our backyard, and we don't know what's going on in our own backyard, and that is irresponsible. This goes back to one of our previous conversations about if we were doing enough already, a lot of these conversations would be moot because we would be demonstrating not only to ourselves, but to our friends, allies, and to our potential adversaries that we take these things seriously. We have practiced what I call reluctant minimalism when it comes to both military and non-military investments in the Arctic. We do not have the surveillance capabilities that we should have. We do not have the infrastructure that we should have. We do not have the platforms necessary to both sustain operations for long periods of time or to act independently in the Arctic, both manned and unmanned, crewed and uncrewed, whatever version you want to use. And so this is an area where, to be honest, we have paid lip service to this, and we legitimately are being criticized. And this is an area that it goes into the category of we should have been doing this for decades. But now that we're being called out for it, this is an area where we not only have a responsibility to step up, but I believe we have an enormous opportunity. There are very few countries in the world who can do some of the things that we can do. There are very few industries in the world, and this comes to a huge part that most people don't understand. We have some amazing technology in Canadian industry that can support some of these military or military adjacent capabilities that we need in that very challenging environment. And so I'll stop there and just say we have to do more. We can do more. We have an obligation to do more, and we need to be more innovative. And I can talk about some examples of that. It comes back to owning stuff. There's lots of commercial activity in the Arctic right now that we could be partnering with and have arrangements with to use infrastructure, for example, that isn't necessarily fully leveraged at the moment, or we could, access it when it's needed, as opposed to creating white elephant programs where we spend hundreds of millions of billions of dollars on something that they're not fit for purpose, or they end up sitting vacant until somebody decides to show up and turn the lights on. And that's just a stupid way to do business.
Oh, I want to talk about Battle of the Atlantic Sunday in a second. We'll have a few minutes left, but what then would be a couple examples of what you could see in the Arctic, in the North, if investment and actual, like you said, talking with Indigenous communities, working together, and actually investing in stuff that works? What would the picture be?
Okay, well, I'll give you three areas of example. The first one is in technology, and two parts of technology. There's military capability and technology. We've talked about. There's a recent announcement before the election about radar, over-the-horizon radar, those kinds of things. We have to do a much better job of surveying our own Arctic space. Space-based sensors, land-based sensors, sea-based sensors on the seabed that allow us to listen through the water to submarines that are operating in the area, robotic capabilities under the water, under the ice, these kinds of things. We've talked about submarines, or we didn't, but submarines are on the shopping list of necessary capabilities. These are all areas that are well behind where they should be. We've dabbled in some of them, and we have very good capabilities in others that we need to harness and really lean into aggressively and with a sense of ambition. That's partly what we're lacking. As it relates to the Indigenous communities and other areas of investment, something that comes to mind is power production, power generation. There are some really innovative technologies that are available that can be modularized and containerized to provide portable power generation in some cases that are not using fossil fuels or that are much more efficient, that can not only help with power generation for remote communities, but they can have military applications that, because they're portable, you can now put them on platforms, you can put them into platforms, and your imagination is not out of step with the idea. And then the last one is infrastructure, which I mentioned specifically. There's a number of mining companies that operate in the north, for example, that have unused infrastructure or shared infrastructure that they're operating 24/7. And the military doesn't need 24/7, but it needs access to. We need to be partnering with those types of organizations, coming up with very simple arrangements for access, as opposed to, as I said, building stuff at huge expense to the taxpayer that then sits and rots when it's not being used in an efficient way. So those are a few ideas.
Thank you. Under a minute and change, Battle of the Atlantic Sunday is coming. Thoughts in about a minute?
Well, okay, so Battle of Atlantic, the longest continuous campaign in the Second World War, 2,074 days, and much of it connected directly to St. John's and the island of Newfoundland. The convoy escort forces were a lot of them organized here in St. John's before it was part of Canada, as your listeners know. 80th anniversary of the end of the campaign in 1945 is this May. Sadly, because it went on so long, enormous losses. Hundreds of ships, thousands of sailors, both military and civilian. But ultimately, this was about keeping the sea lines of communication open, the logistics. I mean, your listeners will understand supply chain and logistics. Were it not for the Battle of the Atlantic, the United Kingdom specifically would have fallen, and much of Europe would have been lost to the German efforts in the early 40s. So there's your short version.
Thank you for that. And folks, we're doing a full Battle of the Atlantic show in lead up coming Monday. So do tune in for that. Mark Norman, thank you so much.
Adam, thank you. And thank you to your listeners for putting up with me.
Folks, we got a little signal line to play, and then I'll promo tomorrow.
Hi, CBC radio listeners. Come join me, Vicki Hines, for my third edition of A Case of You, songs by Joni Mitchell, this May 30th and 31st at the LSPU Hall. Performing earlier and later songs by Joni Mitchell are Nico Paolo, Janet Cole, Kelly McMichael, Natasha Blackwood, Andrea Monroe, Janina McGilvery, Natalie Nosworthy, Carolyn Martin Rowe, Jenny Gear, Mary Barry, and Laurie Cooper. Plus, this year we are joined by a house band, The Lonely Painters, with Patty Byrne, Graham Ellsworth, Steve Finn, and John Moran. Tickets are $54.50, all charges included, and can be purchased online at www.lspuhall.ca or by calling the hall at 709-753-4531. Or just drop down to the LSPU Hall box office during box office hours at 3 Victoria Street. See you at the hall.
Thanks for that, folks. You can call the signal line anytime, 709-576-5260. Tomorrow on the show, we are talking the meaning of remembrance, sticking with a military theme. Do tune in.